Right, should we start? Brilliant. Don't I feel popular? Wow, look at this, amazing. So there is always one, isn't there? You're in a seminar or on a course, and there's always one individual, the one who is actively listening to the lecturer, the one who is taking copious notes, the one who is asking questions, the one who genuinely appears to be happy to be there learning. Well, I have a confession. That person is me. Hands up. It's been me for the last 30 years, and I even went as far as to devise a strapline to the effect when I set up my consultancy, AW Fire. The strapline is dedicated to competence, because I'm dedicated to being competent at what I do, dedicated to being a competent fire risk assessor and a competent fire engineer. But I didn't offer to speak here today to polish some metaphorical halo. I'm here because I want to help you. Because I've had the privilege over the last 10 years of reviewing a substantial number of membership and registration applications. I've mentored more than 200 professionals in our industry, and in the course of doing all of that, of reading a lot of other people's CPD records. And so it's given me some perspective about levels of competence in our industry, about people's understanding of CPD, and about people's attitudes towards competence. My volunteering has made me realise that not everyone is quite so devoted to learning as me. Yet anyone who has professional membership of an industry institution, so the IFE, the IFSM, CABE, IOSH, RICS, REBA, name another, they're required to undertake CPD, continuing professional development. And the requirement is somewhere between 25 and 35 hours each year. So my teenage son often has some words of wisdom for me. And one is that I should work smarter, not harder. And that's what I want to try and do in the next 40 minutes. Help you to work smarter, not harder, when it comes to competence and CPD. Okay, so the thought of having to fit in a whole week's worth of learning sometime in the next 12 months, well, it can feel a bit like this, can't it? And yet, the evidence is now in front of all of us. Competence in fire safety across relevant professions has very clearly been shown to be lacking based on all we now know about the Grenfell Tower disaster. Grenfell Tower was the culmination of a situation that I've watched unfold over the last 30 years in my career. Back when fire certificates still existed, in the days before the concept of risk assessment, we had prescriptive guides. I don't know how many of you remember these. Prescriptive guides like these. And as we moved to wanting more flexibility in our design work, we swapped these prescriptive requirements for functional requirements. As long as you meet this intent, you can do it in any way you choose. But to do this requires a higher level of competence than prescriptive requirements demanded. Unfortunately, instead of demanding higher levels of competence, we then saw training courses move from exam-based to being attendance-based, which meant you received a certificate not for demonstrating your ability, but actually for turning up and sitting on a chair. Whilst it didn't happen overnight, we watched a gradual degradation in the level of knowledge of those working in the profession. So meanwhile, over those decades, the functional requirements enabled more innovative and more complex buildings to be created. We have bigger spaces and less compartmentation, active solutions rather than passive solutions, and different materials. we certainly have more combustible materials. And all of this created greater fire safety challenges for designers and for those managing buildings. We introduced more failure points into our systems, more holes in the Swiss cheese model of accident causation. To me, it's been something of a perfect storm. Demands on competence have increased, yet requirements to demonstrate that competence have decreased. And that leaves a gap between what we need to know to do our job competently and what we actually know. A gap in our level of knowledge where we can fall down and where we did fall down. So the 2018 Hackett Review, Building a Safer Future, that identified our industry competence shortcomings. And as a result, there was a competence steering group set up, the CSG, and it comprised 150 institutions and associations, which produced a 164-page report. Now, the aim is to improve the competence of everyone procuring, designing, constructing, inspecting higher-risk residential buildings. As a result, various parties have now started calling for us all to focus on competence. But what does that actually mean? What does that mean for the individual? And what does that mean for the organisation? Now that we've identified competence inadequacies in our sector, I want to talk through some simple actions we can take to identify the gaps in our collective and individual knowledge, and then look at some practical steps we can take to move forward. So how can we shift from thinking of CPD as an inconvenience box-ticking exercise, which, let's face it, many of us do view it as, and take it as an opportunity to do our jobs better? So firstly, let's look at the definition of competence and address the SCEB acronym that is now being regularly used to define competence. So don't blame you if you look at this picture and look rather quizzically. I typed SCEB into an internet search engine, and apparently SCEB is Japanese anime. There you go. So there's some learning for you today. Who knew? But in terms of competence, SCEB is used as an acronym. It's skills, knowledge, experience, and behaviours. And it's these aspects that we define competence and say that it consists of. Until recently, it was SKE, S-K-E, skills, knowledge, and experience. And it's only latterly that we've added that B for behaviour. That's a relatively new introduction. So what we're saying is that competence is partly about skills, it's partly about knowledge, it's partly about experience, and it's partly about behaviour. It's saying that being competent is likely to involve all four of these things. So if we were to consider someone who has just passed a course, they may have the knowledge, but in order to become competent, they need to practice using that knowledge and gain experience to become skilled. Then they need to act in the right way and behave in the right way as well. So all professional institutions have codes of conduct, and here I've got the Engineering Council's Statement of Ethical Principles. And that talks about behaviours such as honesty, integrity, respect, leadership, rigour, and communication. So these behavioural aspects of being competent are not technical ability. They focus more on how we go about doing our work and the responsibilities of being a professional. Okay. So what on earth am I doing putting this image up? Well, I want to talk about limitations. Do we know what our limitations are? Do we know where the limitations of our competence lies? Do we know what work is within our competence and what work is outside our competence? So this gymnast needs to know what she is competent at and what she isn't competent at, and what she's going to attempt, whether that's beyond her competence, because if she tries to do that, potentially she's going to risk getting hurt. If she's not competent, she's either got to not do it, decline the opportunity, or think about what measures she needs to put in place to attempt that move? So does she need to break the move down into smaller components? Does she need to work with someone? And it's exactly the same concept for us as professionals. We need to recognise and be aware of the limits of our own competence. If we're going to operate outside of our own competencies, then what measures are we going to put in place to support us? So if we continue thinking about that idea of there being a gap between where we are right now with our competence and where we need or want to be, the concept of CPD is that there's likely to be that gap where we are right now in terms of competence and where we need to be. So the question is, how do we bridge that gap? I suppose another way of thinking about it would be that we're in one location and we want to get to a different location. So we need a map to get there. In terms of competence, we do have those maps, and they are called Competency Frameworks. So this is one for IOSH, and they set out skills, knowledge, the things that we need to operate at a particular level of competence. And the skills and knowledge we need here are split into 3 groups. So IOSH look at technical skills, core skills, and behaviour skills. And then they split those into further subgroups that are shown on that wheel there. The Engineering Council has a competence framework, and that splits it between engineering technicians, incorporated engineers — I'm very proud to be an incorporated engineer — and chartered engineers. And the Engineering Council chooses to split competence differently. They choose A to E, and they choose knowledge, problem solving, leadership, communication, and professional commitment. And what we see is that these 5 categories, actually only 2 of them relate to technical aspects, and then 2 of them relate to working with others, and then the last one relates to ethics or professional commitment. So if we think about it like a pie chart, what we're saying is that only 40% of competence is actually about technical aspects. What's equally important is how we work with others, and then there's also ethics that's a significant aspect of competence. So what I want to draw from this is that it's not solely about doing the technical courses and gaining knowledge about technical topics such as fire risk assessment or new legislation or smoke control. There's other important aspects of competence, such as how we interact with others, such as ethics, things like honesty, integrity, respect. Maybe saying, I don't know, when we don't know. Maybe asking for help when we need help, or even declining work because it's outside of our sphere of competence. The ASFP have a competence framework for fire engineers. Interestingly, their framework only looks at technical subjects, and then they refer you to the non-technical. So they have fire science, human behaviour, fire protection, and fire protection analysis. The Fire Risk Assessment Competency Council, they have a criteria for fire risk assessors. That's another competency framework. And again, that focuses solely on technical aspects. But again, the expectation I would suggest is that the technical aspects are only one part of your competence. And then finally, I've just added one more example, and this one's the Fire Sector Federation's benchmark standards for fire risk assessors. So again, it's a competency framework. It's more aligned to the Engineering Council's list, so it's got technical aspects, but it also has skills around working with others, managing work, and then the ethics and responsibility side. But what we're trying to do is use one or more of these competency frameworks as a tool. It's a map. We want to see what we're expected to be competent at and identify gaps where we might be lacking. So now, if we're comparing our current abilities to one of these competence frameworks, ideally we want to be objective. And that can sometimes be easier said than done. So we could have someone, bearing in mind this slide, we could have someone with an inflated concept of their own competencies, couldn't we? But equally, equally, we could be someone who's far too self-critical and not consider ourselves to be as good as we actually are. So here are some ways which I've thought of to try and gain some objective feedback in terms of a skills gap analysis. So one would be to grade yourself against one of those competency frameworks and then give your analysis to somebody else for feedback to see whether they agree or disagree on your strengths and weaknesses. Another way would be to ask someone else to read some of your reports and give you feedback. That's certainly something that I do. Here's my report. I'm proud of what I've done here. Tell me what you think. But there you need to choose wisely, don't you? I could get it peer reviewed by someone doing the same sort of work as me, perhaps someone who is equally qualified, but I could also get it peer reviewed by someone who's more qualified than me. That probably would be a better decision to make. I know some people will say all our reports are peer reviewed, but are they? What does peer reviewing actually mean? Are they read word for word? I certainly have had my reports peer reviewed and then afterwards found typos, and I'm thinking, well, was that peer reviewing? I'm not sure. I also want to think about the behaviour aspects of competence that we talked about earlier. So who works with attention to detail? Who would spot those grammatical errors or maybe check that the British standards that I'm citing are still current? I had that the other day. I read a proposal and believe it or not, some of the British standards and legislation was 13 years out of date. I mean, how does that get through people sending out proposals every single day? I struggle with that a little bit. I could also think about who my audience is, so I could ask my client for feedback. They need to read the report, don't they? So did they actually understand my report? Was it written in a logical manner? Was the level of technical explanation adequate? And then I could think about, well, who else might read my report? I could think about from a regulatory perspective, so I could maybe say to the building control inspector or a fire safety inspector, what did you think of my fire risk assessment or my fire strategy? And then I could potentially take that concept of audiences a step further, and I could consider who would read my report if there was potential litigation or prosecution. What about getting a lawyer's view of your report? What about your terms and conditions? What about the limitations written into your report? Do you even have exclusions and limitations in your report? Do you have contractual terms and conditions between yourself and the client? Are they appropriate and are they adequate for the work that you've just proposed? Another way would be to sit down with someone and go through a list of competencies together, ask their opinion on what they think you're doing well and what perhaps you need to work on. Word of caution though, of course, you do need to think carefully about who you choose, whether their opinion, you value their opinion, or perhaps how might they respond. You don't want to end up in this sort of situation. It's hard, isn't it, getting feedback, particularly criticism. We're asking people to give us constructive criticism and to discuss our inadequacies. I remember the first briefing note I wrote as an expert witness for the courts, and I agonised over this report. I was really, really proud of it. And I sent it off to my boss for technical review, and I got the email back, and I was like, yep, okay, I'll just have a look. And I opened it, and there it was. It was a sea of colour. There was track changes all over this report. And I have to admit, my first reaction was to run. I left my chair, I went to the kettle, and I made a very strong cup of tea. And I had a little talk with myself, and I said, now look, this is the first time you've done this work. It's not realistic to expect that you're going to be brilliant at this the first time you do it. This, Andrea, is a learning opportunity. So I rationalised that I needed to sit down and work through this constructive criticism, because at the end of the day, I wanted to do a good job and I did want the criticism, but our natural reaction, isn't it, is that we don't want to hear that criticism. I took a deep breath, I took up my strong cup of tea upstairs, and I worked my way through those suggested changes, and actually track changes look far more horrendous than they actually are, aren't they? But we can only get better at doing the work by making mistakes. We don't learn anything if we already know how to do something, can we? So, as objectively as possible, we want to write our gap analysis between where we are currently with our skills, knowledge and experience and where we want to get to. We want to make a plan. For the purposes of this presentation, I've just come up with a small plan, and my suggestion is that I am going to try and learn more about timber, safety cases and listening skills over the next year. It's based on the gaps that I've identified fictitiously in my competence. What it isn't is based on what webinars are coming up or what courses I'm being offered. What I'm doing instead is actually proactively analysing where I am now and where I want to be, rather than what's being offered to me. So these three topics are effectively my career development plan for this year. So I then need to work out how I'm going to gain more competence in these three areas. How am I going to bridge that gap? Or to use the other analogy, how am I going to get to the destination on my map? So that's going to form the basis of my CPD, my continuing professional development for the next year. I might even have other things that want to stretch longer for a year, but for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to do these three things ideally in the next 12 months. But I need to identify how I'm going to gain that knowledge or those skills or that experience. So using this example, I'm going to learn some more about timber, and I've heard about a webinar that's posted on YouTube by Angus Law, thank you very much Angus, from the University of Edinburgh, and he talks about timber in fire. We need to talk about timber. Very good 1 hour webinar. And I'm going to spend an hour watching that YouTube video as part of my CPD. And then I've also seen a LinkedIn post about Code Red, and that's experience on CLT buildings, and I'm going to read the papers about that. Let's say that's another 2 hours. That's some more CPD on timber. And then maybe I'll investigate whether any of the local timber frame manufacturers that I've got near me, whether they're holding open days. And I'll go and attend one of those open days. Or I might see if the Structural Timber Association has got some guides online that I can read up. And that will cover the first aspect, the timber aspect of my CPD for this year. And then I'll also work out a similar plan to become more knowledgeable about safety cases. So as an example, the HSE have a whole page on safety cases, and they have a YouTube video. I might also look wider than just the building safety aspects. I might look at high hazard industries, because they've used safety cases for many, many years already. And I might see if I can find some YouTube videos on that. And take the concepts of that and use that in relation to building safety. Lastly, I want to improve my listening skills. So I might look up a podcast or a book. I have one here. So this book is How to Talk So Kids Will Listen, and Listen So Kids Will Talk. Okay, on the face of it, not terribly work-related, you might think. But if you read the back, it says, learn how to break a pattern of arguments, cope with negative feelings, engage cooperation, set clear limits and maintain goodwill, express emotions without being hurtful, and resolve conflicts peacefully. Well, if we think about the behaviour aspects that I talked about earlier, actually, this is a great book for parenting, and it also does a really good job for me in my work, doesn't it, as well? So over time, I complete the activities I've selected, and then I accrue my CPD hours. But I'm doing it to become more competent in the areas that I identified as having gaps in my skills and my knowledge. So there we go, there's my ticks. Well done me. Okay, so having said all of that, I get it. None of us have enough time in the day to do everything we want to do, and you can happily insert the word of your choice in this picture. My teenagers' words of wisdom now ring in my ears. Work smarter, not harder, Mum. So I thought I'd share a couple of my hacks to getting my CPD hours in every year. There we go. Okay, so this is my exercise route through a local country estate near where I live. I'm here for about an hour several times each week, and I take my phone with me and I listen to a podcast. So I download podcasts that I think will be interesting and insightful from a work experience, from a work point of view. So here we go. I've got here the Fire Science Show. Thank you, Wozciak. Risk, Sleep, Repeat, another really good one. There's also the Brady Haywood podcast. That's really good. And I've got Rebranding Safety here as well, James McPherson. So I will listen to these as I am walking around my country estate walk. I'll listen to them on long car journeys, like this morning coming here. I'll listen to them on the train, or cooking, or walking to the shop for milk, doing the gardening, walking the dog. Okay, I don't have a dog, but you kind of get the picture, yeah? I will try and multitask, get my CPD in at the same time as doing life stuff. It's incredibly easy, I would say, to find that you've actually done your CPD hours in a couple of weeks doing this, maybe at the gym. If what you're actually listening to is bridging those competence gaps, then it is CPD. I think we have this expectation that CPD needs to be sitting somewhere, listening to someone and taking it in. And actually, I would strongly suggest to you that CPD is a much wider variety of activities than purely just sitting and absorbing knowledge and information from somebody. This is my second recommendation. This is the Seven Stars pub near Petersfield. And this is where I meet with my friends every roughly 6 weeks. There are 5 of us, 5 fire engineers, and we sit in here and we talk shop. I created it and I named it. I named it Fire Engineering at the Pub because I'm not very creative, I am practical. So we discuss the jobs we've done, we ask each other questions, and we help each other. We have dinner. I particularly like the braised shin with mash. And we spend about 3 hours here chatting. It's a really good CPD opportunity, so I put 3 hours in my CPD log for being in the pub, and it's a good mentoring opportunity as well. Which brings me on to my third suggestion. Mentoring. So, not necessarily your boss or your manager, but someone who you have purposefully selected and approached and asked if they would be willing to mentor you. So did you know that you're entitled to claim CPD points for being mentored and also for being a mentor? So you could actually... I offer to pay my mentors for their time. They don't necessarily, bill me for it, but I offer. I book an appointment to speak to them, and if we meet in person, then I pay for the refreshments. I wouldn't dream of arranging an appointment and not turning up. I think that sort of behaviour speaks volumes, doesn't it? And I try to be focused on explaining to them what I need their help with. I tend to send them a token present, maybe at Christmas, and a thank you card for helping me if I achieve something that they've been helping me with, like, I don't know, membership of an institution or something, just so that I recognise their contribution and make them realise that I acknowledge what they've done to help me. If you think that people won't agree to helping you, I can tell you that I have never had someone say no to me to being a mentor for me. So I've never been declined a request that I've made. I see mentoring as a way of giving back to our industry and of paying the help that I've received, paying that forward. People have been very generous to me over the years, and so I mentor in order to give that back. So, don't be frightened, I would say, about asking someone to be a mentor, because based on my experience, people are genuinely willing to help you. And that's what it's all about, isn't it? Working together, helping each other, collectively doing the best job we can. And I wonder if maybe sometimes we forget that. So let me just go back to this idea of learning and growing. And to do so, we need to step out of our comfort zone, don't we? We don't learn or improve when we stay within our comfort zone. And that's not always an easy thing to do, acknowledging our inadequacies and making ourselves feel vulnerable. But if you can do it, I can attest that the opportunities are there. So before lockdown, I would never have dreamt of sitting here and doing this. I would never have dreamt of being on a British Standards Committee. I would never have dreamt of running my own consultancy or acting as an expert witness for the courts. So, I would say to you, there's opportunities there for you. By my example, if you're willing to perhaps make yourself vulnerable and do things to learn and to grow. I think what you do have to do is accept that failure is likely, but you can fail forward rather than fail backwards. I've taken a lot of qualifications over the years and applied for various registrations. I can tell you I didn't pass them all the first time. But what I have done is seen it as, okay, I've passed 90% of it, and now I've only got 10% of it left to succeed in, left to comply with. So, I think sometimes we can be put off by just the enormity and the fear of I'm not going to pass. But what I try to do is just, take the thought of what's the worst that can happen. I'm going to get a really awful letter that says I haven't made it this time and I'm going to have to resubmit, but actually the potential's there that I have passed. So, I try and look at it of what's the worst that can happen. So on that note, I'll close with a comment about demonstrating competence. So saying you're competent is one thing, isn't it? But actually proving it is another. Understanding whether the various logos and post-nominals, the letters after people's names, whether they were available simply for payment or whether they are actually evidence of a level of competence and whether they represent relevant competence to what you're actually looking for. So I'm an incorporated engineer, very proud of that, via the IFE. I'm also a chartered building engineer through CABE. So does that make me competent to look at external walls and do external wall surveys? Does the fact that I have the RICS external wall assessment qualification mean I'm competent to assess external walls? Does the fact that I'm on the IFE's fire risk assessors register, does that make me competent as a fire risk assessor? Does it make me competent to do a fire risk assessment on a small shop? What about at a historic building? Or what about a care home? None of these accreditations and registrations on their own actually demonstrate competence. And I think it's really important if you're a client who uses consultants that you undertake, that you use consultants who undertake fire safety work. I would really urge you to establish what questions you want to ask as part of your due diligence to establish an individual's competence. And if you're a fire safety professional, I would say that being able to demonstrate your competence through some of these accreditations and registrations, as well as your experience, it is going to become increasingly important. And understanding them and applying for those registrations, that is a whole different topic for another day. But for today, I will say thank you for listening. I'm Andrea White, and I am happy to answer any questions from the floor if you have them. Thanks. Yeah, we've got 10 minutes if anyone's got a question. There's a question here.
1, 2. Andrea, I love your passion. Brilliant presentation. I haven't really got a question, but it's more of an information to support you. When you do an individual analysis on someone's skills or knowledge, if you look at learning developments 1 to 13, so there's this National Occupational Standards, Standard 2, for identifying someone's skills, knowledge, what they want to be. And if you look at Standard 7, that'll be the facilitation. I'll show you them, I've got them. The important thing that what you've got there is you've got the law saying that people need to have the skills and knowledge to do what they do. What people will be looking for is where are the skills and knowledge. This will point you then to the Sector Skills Council, because you want to know what the Sector Skills Council say about skills and knowledge, because they are appointed by government and they write the skills and knowledge that's basically for each trade. So if we're going to be stood in the witness box and say, can you prove that you have the skills and knowledge to be, I don't know, an installation of sprinkler systems or an installation of fire protection systems? You can have the skills and knowledge because I achieved them and you wrote them. Just with passive fire protection, the thing probably to note from a compliance point of view is you've got 2 different sector skills councils. So you might be stood in if you like, in a construction site, and on the left-hand side, you've got someone that's fitting a wall or a door. They actually come under construction skills. And then on the right-hand side, you've got someone who's putting a sprinkler in. They are different health and safety standards. Not because we say so, because the sector skills wrote them. So the key to compliance and legal compliance is the government standards for skills and knowledge, and they exist.
I think that's an interesting point. I think I'm not aware of these documents that you're talking about, and I think that's really interesting, isn't it? Because I see myself as quite diligent.
Yeah.
And I think the worry that I have is that we have made all of this competence stuff too complicated. I genuinely believe that it is now in the too hard pile for people.
Yeah.
And I think, even just listening to what you said, with the greatest respect, I just, it's complicated. And I think for me, what I want to do is go back to basics and say, can I do what I should, what I'm being asked to do? Am I competent? And also, can I demonstrate it? I think, we had all these great MVQs and all the rest of it. And, I've done an MVQ3 in something or other, health and safety, I think it was, and I've put together a portfolio. But, who's actually checked that? Who's actually checked my competence?
Where's the judgment? And that's what people will be looking for is, with the greatest respect, I'll move away from competence. I mean, I might be competent to drive a car to the supermarket, but if I don't have a driving license, I'm not legally compliant. So I would urge people to not just think about competence, but what does the law say? Where's that law and where's that certificate? I think you're right with the MVQs. I think it's all about judgments, and the last time a lot of people had judgments made against them for performance and knowledge was a driving license. So who's making the judgment, and is that accountable, and is it traceable? Because that's what you're going to want in this digital footprint. We've got people that are signing off systems and equipment and components, but there's a digital footprint now. It'd be like doing an audit on a delivery organisation in 6 months' time, and we've got dates, times, locations, and then actually realise no one has a driving licence. That's the challenges we face in the sector. But love the presentation.
Thank you. Any more questions? One question here, and then I think we'll call it a day.
Yes, Andrea, thank you very much for that. But have you ever set an annual plan to learn to update competence, come to the end of the year and realise it hasn't worked. And how did you turn that round? How did you build on that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So I suppose, yes, but I take the view that I've probably moved forward. It just might not necessarily be in the way forward that I was expecting to. So maybe I have to go via point B to get to my final destination. I think it's really easy, isn't it, to sort of criticise yourself and to see the negatives. I think what you do have to be kind to yourself and go, well, hang on a minute, that was my plan, that didn't work out, but look at all the other great stuff that I've done, and actually I can do this later on. We now have to go back to that, but we had to put that on hold for another time. So I think it's about supporting yourself and actually encouraging yourself rather than criticising yourself, because that's just not productive, is it? I think you want to sort of be on your own side, if you like. Thank you, everyone. Really appreciate you being here.